Sudan, 1982. A dusty coastal road winds along the Red Sea, past villages that haven't changed in centuries. The heat is suffocating, the landscape is barren, and on a forgotten stretch of beach, a group of European tourists arrive at a small resort that nobody's heard of. They're here to dive, they say, to explore the coral reefs, to enjoy the sun. The locals don't ask questions. Tourism is not very common here, but money is always important. In fact, these tourists are not real tourists, and no one knows it. They are Mossad agents themselves, and the facility they have just opened is not a real resort, but a front for one of the most unbelievable rescue operations in intelligence history. Over the next 4 years, thousands of Ethiopian Jews will pass through this place, starving, exhausted, and running for their lives. They'll be hidden in the back rooms, fed in secret, and smuggled onto boats in the dead of night, and the entire operation will be run by a handful of Israeli operatives, pretending to be diving instructors. This is the story of Arous Village, a resort that led to the saving of many lives, an operation that blurred the line between humanitarian aid and espionage, and a story of men who were willing to sacrifice their lives to rescue a people standing on the edge of extinction. The people Mossad was trying to save were known as Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, a community that had lived in Ethiopia for more than 2,000 years, isolated from the rest of the Jewish world. They practiced an ancient form of Judaism, followed the Torah, observed the Sabbath, and believed they were descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. But by the 1980s, their world was collapsing. Chaos ruled in Ethiopia. In 1974, a brutal regime seized power, overthrowing Emperor Haile Selassie and pushing the country into civil war. This new government, known as the Derg, ruled with an iron fist: political purges, mass executions, forced relocations, and in the midst of this violence, a catastrophic famine struck. Crops failed, livestock died, entire villages were abandoned as people fled in search of food. For the Beta Israel, the situation was even worse. They were a minority in a country that had never fully accepted them. They were called Falasha, a derogatory term meaning strangers or outsiders. They were denied land ownership, excluded from many professions, and when the famine hit, they were among the first to suffer. Thousands began to die. Hunger, disease, violence. And before the survivors lay an impossible choice: stay and die, or risk everything on a journey toward the promised land, Israel, a place most had only heard of in prayers. A land they had dreamed of for generations, but never seen. The journey to Israel required crossing into Sudan, Ethiopia's neighbor to the west, and this was where the real danger began. Sudan was not a safe place for Ethiopian Jews. The government in Khartoum was hostile to Israel. Officially, the two countries had no diplomatic relations. Sudan had fought against Israel in the Arab-Israeli wars. It supported the Palestine Liberation Organization and had formed an alliance with the Soviet Union. If Sudanese authorities realized that Ethiopian refugees were trying to reach Israel, they would be arrested, imprisoned, or face something worse. Yet there was no other route but Sudan. Ethiopia's other borders led to hostile territories or impassable terrain. The Red Sea offered a path, but reaching it required crossing Sudan first. And so, thousands of Beta Israel began to walk. They traveled in small groups, families, sometimes entire villages. They walked at night to avoid bandits and government patrols. They crossed deserts where the temperature reached 120 degrees during the day. They navigated mountains and river valleys with no maps and no guides. Many died along the way. Children, elderly, the sick. Their bodies were left behind, buried in shallow graves or abandoned in the sand. Those who survived reached the refugee camps on the Sudanese side of the border. Vast, sprawling camps filled with tens of thousands of people trying to escape hunger and war. The camps were run by international aid organizations, the United Nations, the Red Cross. They provided food, water, and shelter, But the camps were also monitored by Sudanese security forces, and this created a terrifying dilemma for Ethiopian Jews. If they identified themselves as Jews, they risked arrest. Sudan's government would not allow Jewish refugees to travel to Israel. But if they hid their identity, they were trapped. Aid organizations couldn't help them leave. They had no passports and no visas. With no legal way to travel, they waited for months, sometimes for years. They lived in tents. They survived on whatever food they could find, watching their children grow weak from malnutrition and hoping that somehow someone would come for them. In Tel Aviv, Israeli intelligence was watching. Mossad had been monitoring the Beta Israel crisis since the late 1970s. They knew about the famine, they knew about the refugee camps, and they knew that thousands of Ethiopian Jews were waiting in Sudan with no way out. For Israel, this was more than a humanitarian crisis. It was a question of identity. Thanks to the law of return passed in 1950, all Jews living in different countries around the world were granted the right to immigrate to Israel. Beta Israel were Jews, ancient Jews, and they were dying. If Israel did nothing, an entire community could be wiped out. But acting was not simple. Sudan was enemy territory. Israel had no diplomatic presence there, no legal way to operate, and the Sudanese government would never allow Israeli planes to land and evacuate refugees. Any operation would have to be covert, illegal, and extraordinarily risky. Mossad began developing plans. They considered airlifts, overland smuggling routes, bribery of Sudanese officials. Each option had problems. Airlifts were too visible. Smuggling was too slow. Bribery was unreliable. Then someone proposed something unbelievable. What if Mossad established a permanent presence in Sudan? Not hidden, but in plain sight. A business, a legitimate operation that could move freely without raising suspicion. Something that would give them access to the coast, the boats, and the refugee camps. Something like a resort. The idea was extraordinary. Mossad would purchase or lease a property on the Sudanese coast. They would staff it with operatives posing as European tourists and business people. They would run an actual diving resort, serving real guests, making real money. And under this cover, they would smuggle Ethiopian Jews out of Sudan by sea. The boats came at night. The resort was the place where the refugees were hidden. And when conditions were right, they were transported across the Red Sea to Israel, or to rendezvous points where Israeli Navy ships could pick them up. The operation required meticulous planning and nerves of steel, because a single mistake, one moment of suspicion, could lead to the arrest or death of everyone involved, agents and refugees alike. The man chosen to lead this operation was not a typical spy. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Danny, not his real name. Mossad operatives involved in covert operations rarely used their true identities, even decades later. Danny was in his 30s, fluent in multiple languages, experienced in undercover work. He had operated in hostile environments before. But this was a different kind of mission. It wasn't about stealing documents or recruiting agents. It was about saving lives, and it would require living a double life. Not for days or weeks, but for years. He would have to become someone else entirely. A resort manager, a diving enthusiast, a businessman with no connection to Israel. And he would have to do it in a country where discovery meant death. Mossad assembled a small team, 6 operatives, each with different skills. Some were trained in diving and marine operations. Others had experience in logistics and supply chains. One was a medic, another spoke Arabic fluently. They would pose as European investors who had decided to open a diving resort on the Red Sea. The cover story was plausible. Sudan's coastline was largely undeveloped. The coral reefs were untouched, and there were European travelers who might be interested in discovering a remote, unspoiled place. The Sudanese government, desperate for foreign currency, would welcome such an investment. That was what Mossad was counting on. The location they chose was called Arous, a small village on the coast, about 30 miles north of Port Sudan. There was an abandoned resort there, a collection of small buildings, a dock, a beach. It had been built years earlier by an Italian entrepreneur who had run out of money and abandoned the project. The structures were in disrepair. The plumbing didn't work and the roof was leaking, but it was perfect for what Mossad wanted to do. It was completely isolated. Nearby were refugee camps located further inland, and these places were accessible by sea. Mossad negotiated the lease through a series of intermediaries, shell companies based in Europe, lawyers who asked no questions, payments made in cash. By late 1982, the property was theirs. The team arrived in Sudan in early 1983. They traveled separately, using false passports, Swiss, German, French. They met in Khartoum and then traveled together to Arous. When they arrived, the place was worse than they expected. The buildings were falling apart. There was no electricity, no running water. The beach was littered with debris. But they couldn't back out now. They never stepped outside the cover story, and they got to work. They hired local workers to repair the buildings. They installed generators and water tanks. They purchased boats and diving equipment. The signs were painted. Arous Village, open for business. And over time, the resort began to take shape. The first real guests arrived in the summer of 1983. A group of European divers who had heard about the untouched reefs off Sudan's coast. They stayed for a week. They dove. They ate meals prepared by the team. They drank beer in the evening and shared stories about other diving trips. And they had no idea that the people serving them were Israeli intelligence officers. The operation was going exactly as planned. The cover was holding, and now the real mission could begin. The logistics of the rescue operation were staggering. Mossad couldn't simply drive into the refugee camps and start loading people onto trucks. The camps were monitored. Sudanese security forces conducted regular patrols. Aid workers asked questions, and the Ethiopian Jews themselves were terrified. Many didn't know who to trust. They had heard rumors about people who claimed they wanted to help, but in reality robbed refugees or handed them over to the authorities. Because of this, Mossad had to choose the people it worked with through intermediaries. Trusted members of the Beta Israel community who knew the refugees, could identify them, and quietly spread the word. There's a way out, a route to Israel, but you have to be patient. You have to wait for instructions, and you have to tell no one. The intermediaries were carefully chosen. Some were Ethiopian Jews who had already made it to Israel and volunteered to return to Sudan to help others. Others were aid workers who sympathized with the cause and were willing to take enormous personal risks. They moved through the camps quietly. A conversation here, a whispered message there. They identified the families who would make the journey. Those healthy enough to survive it. Those they knew would not panic, talk, or betray them. And when a group was ready, word was sent to Arous. The next phase could begin. Transportation from the camps to the resort was the most dangerous part. The refugees couldn't simply walk to the coast. It was too far, too exposed. So Mossad used trucks. Old, battered vehicles that looked like they belonged to local merchants or aid organizations. The trucks would arrive at designated meeting points near the camps, usually at night. The refugees were rushed onto the trucks, hidden under tarps or between crates. As night fell, the trucks set off, traveling the entire route along dirt roads, praying all the way that Sudanese patrols would not stop them. The drivers, all either operatives or villagers paid for the job, would present false documents. They claimed they were transporting goods to Port Sudan. Sometimes, when necessary, they offered bribes. It didn't always work, but most of the time it did. There were close calls, trucks searched by suspicious soldiers, refugees discovered hiding in the back. One night, a truck broke down halfway to the coast. The refugees had to walk the remaining miles in the dark, guided by an operative who spoke no Amharic and communicated entirely through hand gestures. Another time, a Sudanese patrol demanded to inspect a truck that was carrying 15 refugees. The driver, a Mossad operative, calmly explained that he was transporting workers to a construction site. The soldier looked skeptical. He moved toward the back of the truck. He began to pull back the tarp. And at that exact moment, a voice came through the radio, a call for help from another patrol. He dropped the tarp and told the truck to move on. The refugees arrived at Arous 3 hours later, shaking and silent. At the resort, the operatives had developed a system. When refugees arrived, they were brought in after dark. They were hidden in back rooms, away from any areas where real guests might wander. They were given food, water, and medical attention. Many were severely malnourished. Some had infected wounds from the journey. Children were often the worst off. Dehydrated, feverish, too weak to walk. The team's medics worked non-stop, day and night, treating illnesses and injuries with very limited resources. There was no hospital nearby. There was nowhere to take someone who was seriously ill. If saving someone was not possible, that person died quietly, and their body was buried at sea to avoid raising questions. The refugees stayed at the resort for as little time as possible, sometimes just a few hours, sometimes several days if the weather was bad or Israeli naval vessels weren't in position. During this time, they had to remain absolutely silent. The resort was operational. Real guests were staying there, European divers who had paid good money to explore the reefs. If they heard voices in the night, if they saw people who weren't supposed to be there, the entire operation could collapse. So the refugees waited in darkness, in dark back rooms with no windows. Parents covered their children's mouths to keep them from crying. Elderly men and women were so exhausted they no longer had the strength to speak, sitting completely still. And the Mossad operatives moved between two worlds. During the day, they served guests and drinks. At night, they coordinated evacuations over the radio. The sea evacuations were conducted with military precision. Israeli naval vessels, usually small fast boats or occasionally larger ships, would approach the Sudanese coast after midnight. They stayed beyond the 12-mile territorial limit, waiting for a signal. At the resort, refugees were loaded onto small boats, zodiacs or fishing vessels, that could navigate the shallow waters near the beach. The boats would motor out into the darkness, running without lights, guided only by GPS coordinates and the faint glow of stars. When they reached the rendezvous point, the Israeli vessels appeared, darker silhouettes on the dark water, revealed by the moonlight. The refugees were transferred quickly, 15 minutes, sometimes even less. Then the Israeli boats changed course, disappeared into the open sea, and carried their passengers toward safety. Not every evacuation went smoothly. The Red Sea is unpredictable. Storms could blow in without warning, turning calm water into chaos. Waves high enough to capsize small boats, winds that made navigation impossible. One night, a boat carrying 23 refugees was caught in a sudden squall. The engine died. Water poured over the sides. The refugees, most of whom had never seen the ocean before, were convinced they were going to die. The Mossad operative piloting the boat, a man who had grown up sailing off the coast of Haifa, worked frantically to restart the engine while bailing water with his hands. After 40 minutes that felt like 40 minutes hours, the engine struggled back to life. They reached the rendezvous point 2 hours late. The Israeli Navy vessel was still waiting for them. The operation expanded quickly. In the first 6 months, Mossad evacuated several hundred Ethiopian Jews. By the end of 1983, the number had reached over 1,000. Word spread through the refugee camps. There was a way out, a secret route. People began arriving at the camps specifically because they had heard about the rescue operation, and Mossad struggled to keep up with the demand. The resort could only hold so many people at once. The boats could only make so many trips. The risk of exposure was increasing with every evacuation. Sudanese security forces had started asking questions. Why was this remote resort so active and busy? Why were trucks constantly coming and going at night? And who were these Europeans really? Mossad considered shutting down the operation. The risk was becoming too great, but shutting down meant abandoning thousands of people who were counting on this lifeline. So they pushed forward, they became more careful, they varied their routes, they used different vehicles, they bribed more officials, and they relied increasingly on luck. Because in an operation this complex, lasting this long and carried out in a hostile country, luck was not a renewable resource. Sooner or later, it would run out. The turning point came in late 1984. The Israeli government decided to escalate. They launched what would be called Operation Moses, a massive coordinated airlift of Ethiopian Jews from Sudan to Israel. It involved not just Mossad, but the Israeli Air Force, government officials, and international diplomacy at the highest levels. The operation was supposed to be secret, but secrets of this magnitude were very difficult to keep. Israeli transport planes began flying into Sudan under the cover of night, landing at military airfields. Thousands of refugees were evacuated within a few weeks, and inevitably, the story leaked. In January 1985, news reports appeared in the international media. Israel was conducting a secret airlift of Ethiopian Jews from Sudan. The Sudanese government, humiliated by the revelation, shut down the operation immediately. The airfields were closed, the remaining refugees were trapped, and suddenly the resort at Arous became more important than ever. It was the only route left. It was more dangerous and more difficult than ever. Sudanese intelligence services were now openly searching for Israeli agents inside the country, and all eyes were on them. Mossad made a calculated decision. They would continue the resort operation, but only for a few more months. They would evacuate as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, and then they would disappear. The final phase, later called Operation Joshua, began in March 1985. Over the next several weeks, the resort evacuated nearly 1,000 more refugees. The pace was frantic. Boats were leaving the beach night after night, one by one, sometimes more than one boat. The operatives were exhausted. They began making mistakes, small ones. A light left on when it should have been off. A refugee spotted by a local fisherman. A radio transmission intercepted by Sudanese signals intelligence. The net was tightening. In May 1985, Mossad received intelligence that Sudanese security forces were planning a raid on the resort. They didn't know exactly when, but it was coming. The team had perhaps a week, maybe less. They began destroying evidence, burning documents, disabling equipment. They evacuated the last group of refugees on a stormy night when visibility was near zero. 37 people were crammed into 2 small boats. The boats managed to reach the rendezvous point on time. The refugees were transferred to an Israeli Navy vessel, and then the Mossad operatives returned to the resort one last time. They staged it to look like they had left in a hurry. Abandoned. Maybe the business had failed. Maybe the investors had run out of money. They left behind just enough to make the story believable. Some furniture, diving equipment. Nothing that could be traced back to Israel. And then, before dawn, they drove to Port Sudan. They boarded separate commercial flights to Europe, using their false passports. And before 48 hours had passed, they were back in Israel. The resort at Arous was deserted. It stood like a ghost town on the edge of the Red Sea. Local scavengers quickly stripped it of everything of value, and within months, the desert began to reclaim it once again. The full story of the operation remained classified for years. The Israeli government said nothing publicly. Mossad operatives who had been involved were forbidden from speaking about it. The resort itself became a local legend in Sudan. People in the area told stories about the strange Europeans who had come and gone. Some believed they were spies. Others thought they were criminals. Some understood the truth, but chose to remain silent. And the Ethiopian Jews who passed through that resort who hid in those dark, airless back rooms and were smuggled onto boats in the darkness, carried those memories with them for the rest of their lives. The numbers tell part of the story, but only part. Between 1982 and 1985, the Arous resort operation and the subsequent airlifts evacuated approximately 8,000 Ethiopian Jews from Sudan to Israel. Some estimates place the number higher, others lower. Record-keeping during the operation was deliberately minimal to protect operational security. Thousands of people who had been left to die in refugee camps due to hunger, disease, or violence survived thanks to this operation and were given the chance to reach Israel. They started new lives. They raised children who never knew the fear their parents had lived through. But the cost was also real. Dozens of refugees died during the journey to Sudan. Some drowned during sea evacuations when boats capsized or engines failed. Others died at the resort itself, too sick or injured to save. The Mossad operatives who ran the operation carried those deaths with them. In interviews conducted years after the operation was declassified, many people spoke about the impossible choices they faced, having to decide who would be evacuated first when there was not enough room for everyone, whether to risk taking someone who was critically ill, knowing they might not survive the journey, how to tell a family that their elderly grandmother was too weak to travel and would have to be left behind. One operative, in a rare moment of candor, described a night when he had to choose between two groups of refugees. The boat could only carry 30 people, but there were 60 waiting. He chose the families with young children. The others were told to wait for the next evacuation. That next evacuation never came. Sudanese security forces raided the staging area the following day. Those refugees were arrested. Some were sent back to Ethiopia. Others vanished into Sudanese prisons. The operative never learned what became of him, and he never stopped questioning whether he had made the right choice. The Ethiopian Jews who reached Israel faced their own challenges. They arrived in a country they had dreamed about but never seen. A modern Western society that was utterly foreign to them. Most spoke no Hebrew. Many had never seen electricity or running water. They came from rural villages where life had changed little in centuries. And suddenly they found themselves in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, surrounded by cars, computers, and people who looked at them with curiosity. The Israeli government established reception and absorption centers to help ease their integration. Hebrew classes, job training, cultural orientation programs. But the gap was enormous. Some adapted quickly, especially the children who learned Hebrew in schools and made Israeli friends. But others struggled. The older generation mourned the world they had left behind, the community they had lost, the traditions that seemed to fade in this new place. And there was discrimination, not official, not legal, but present. Some Israelis questioned whether Ethiopian Jews were truly Jewish. They had different traditions. Their rabbis were not recognized by the religious authorities. For years, Ethiopian immigrants struggled for acceptance, for recognition that their Judaism was just as valid as anyone else's. Yet despite these struggles, the community survived, thrived even. Ethiopian Israelis became soldiers, doctors, teachers, artists. They brought their culture with them, their music and food and stories. They built synagogues that blended Ethiopian tradition with modern Israeli practice. And they never forgot how they had arrived. The long walk through the desert, the refugee camps, the resort on the coast of the Red Sea, the boat journey through dark waters, the first moment they saw the coast of Israel emerge from the morning mist. For Mossad, the operation became a case study in unconventional intelligence work. It demonstrated that espionage agencies could conduct humanitarian missions when national interest and moral obligation aligned. It proved that deep cover operations could be sustained for years in hostile territory with proper planning and discipline. And it showed that sometimes the most effective cover is not hiding in the shadows, but operating in plain sight, a resort that truly functioned as a resort. Guests who were genuinely guests, and a business that made money while serving a completely different purpose. But the operation also revealed the limits of such work. The resort could only evacuate so many people. The operation depended on Sudanese cooperation, or at least indifference, which could evaporate overnight. And when the story leaked, when secrecy failed, the entire structure collapsed instantly. The lesson was clear. Covert operations, no matter how carefully calculated they are, exist on borrowed time. They succeed until they don't. And when they fail, everyone involved pays the price. The Sudanese government never officially acknowledged what had happened. They expelled several Western diplomats on suspicion of involvement. They arrested a handful of local contacts who had helped with the operation. But they never admitted that Israeli operatives had run a rescue operation from Sudanese soil for 3 years. To do so would have been too humiliating. The truth coming out would have shown that their intelligence services had been completely deceived. It would have revealed that foreigners had operated a base on their territory without being detected, so they chose to remain silent, and the resort at Arous gradually faded into obscurity. The story resurfaced decades later in unexpected ways. In 2019, Netflix released a film called The Red Sea Diving Resort, based loosely on the operation. The film took liberties with facts, dramatized certain events, and simplified complex geopolitics into clear heroes and villains. But it brought the story to millions of people who had never heard of Operation Moses or the resort at Arous. Ethiopian Israelis who had been rescued as children later watched this film with their own children, and they told them this: yes, these things really did happen. This is how we came to Israel. This is why we are here. For the Mossad operatives who had run the operation, the film was bittersweet. It got some things right: the basic outline of the mission, the danger, the moral complexity. But it missed the texture of the experience, the grinding exhaustion of maintaining cover for years, the fear that lived in your stomach every time a Sudanese official asked a question, the sound of refugees crying silently in desolate dark rooms, afraid to make a single noise, the burden of knowing that one mistake could cost lives. Hollywood could capture the drama, but never the dread. Some of the operatives spoke publicly after the film's release, carefully, with permission from Israeli intelligence. They corrected factual errors, they provided context, but mostly they talked about the refugees, the families they had met, the children they had carried onto boats, the old men who had kissed their hands in gratitude. They talked about what it meant to save lives instead of taking them, to use intelligence skills not for assassination, but to save lives. And they said that out of all the operations they had taken part in throughout their long careers, this was the one they were most proud of. The operation's legacy lives in the people it saved. In the Ethiopian Israeli community, which now numbers over 150,000, including second and third generations born in Israel. In the stories passed down from grandparents who made the journey, in the annual commemorations held in Israeli cities, where survivors gather to remember those who didn't make it. And sometimes in the quiet awareness that when conditions align and people risk everything, even things that seem difficult or impossible can become possible. There are no monuments to the Arous resort, no plaques marking what happened there. The buildings are long gone, reclaimed by the desert and the sea. If you visited that stretch of Sudanese coast today, you would find nothing to indicate that anything significant ever occurred there. Just sand and rocks and the endless sound of waves. But for those who passed through that place, for the people who hid in those rooms and boarded those boats, it remained one of the most important places in their personal history. It was the place where everything changed, where death turned into life, where despair turned into hope. The operation succeeded because of many factors: meticulous planning, operational discipline, luck. But perhaps most importantly, it succeeded because the people running it believed in what they were doing. They weren't stealing documents or assassinating enemies. They were saving lives. And that belief sustained them through years of stress, danger, and moral ambiguity. It gave them the strength to keep going, even when the risks became hard to bear. And years, even decades later, when they looked back on their careers, it allowed them to say without hesitation that what they had done truly mattered. Intelligence work is usually about secrets, gathering them, protecting them, weaponizing them, but sometimes it's about something simpler and more profound. It's about seeing people in desperate need and deciding that you have the skills and resources to help. It's about understanding that national security and human decency are not always in conflict. Sometimes the most strategic thing a nation can do is to show that it values life, even when doing so is dangerous, costly, and offers no short-term gain. The Arous resort operation was not perfect. People died. Mistakes were made. Not everyone who needed rescue was saved, but it represented intelligence work at its most human. These were not faceless bureaucrats moving pieces on a board, but individuals making impossible choices under crushing pressure, driven by the belief that some things are worth risking everything for. If you found this story compelling, if it changed how you think about intelligence agencies and the work they do, take a moment to share it. These stories matter because they reveal the complexity of the world we live in, the moral gray zones where right and wrong blur together, the moments when ordinary people, or at least people trained to appear ordinary, accomplish extraordinary things. Click the subscribe button for more in-depth content about operations that shaped history, but were never meant to be known. And leave your thoughts in the comments. Could an operation like this work today? Or has technology and surveillance made such long-term deception impossible? Let's discuss that, because the answer reveals as much about our present as it does about that vanished resort on the Red Sea. The Arous holiday village is gone. The operatives who ran it have mostly retired or moved on to other lives. The refugees they saved have become parents and grandparents, building futures their ancestors could only dream of. But the story endures. I want to remind you that sometimes the most important secrets are not about taking lives, but about saving them. And that even in the dark world of espionage, where deception is the currency and trust is a liability, moments of genuine humanity can still emerge. Moments when the mission is not about power or advantage, but about doing what is right simply because it is right. Those are the operations worth remembering, the ones that prove that even in the darkest corners of the intelligence world, light can still find a way in.